It's day 27 of lockdown. It's the 22nd of April. And last night, I don't know if you were able to see the president speak. He spoke. I think he did a good job, but I don't know a lot. So I've invited an old friend, Adrian Saville, Dr. Adrian Saville, to people who don't know him as well as I do, who is a professor at Gibbs and the CEO of Cannon Asset Managers. Adrian, how's it?
Good to be with you, Stuart. The world is moving faster than we can keep up in this environment.
Well, the last time you and I had a conversation, I actually asked you what you would do if you were the president, and you said the first thing you'd do is you'd give a grant of R1,000 per month to every family that needed it for 3 months. You told me it would cost about 55 billion, but it was small fry compared to the damage if we didn't keep people alive with the ability to eat and feed their families. So now here we are, lunchtime, almost after the day the president spoke and made big announcements. Take us through what he said.
Yeah, so amazingly, that conversation that we had was, what, 5 days ago?
Yeah.
And there's been rapidly mounting evidence of the extent, the depth of impacts of COVID-19 on economy, society, families, employment. It's pervasive, it's wide-ranging. And in that conversation that we had, my suggestion to you was we have to go in the very first instance for social fabric, and then not lose sight in putting in place these remedies, the much bigger picture that South Africa has to fix our structural ailments. And that was one of the big announcements in last night's address from the president, where a package of 500 billion has been announced. That's against the backdrop of the already fairly aggressive monetary policy stimulus of 2% interest rate cuts, just over 2% interest rate cuts. So those interest rate cuts bring relief to businesses and households that have stretched balance sheets. It will free up at an economy level about 80 billion rand. But what the package last night does, I would venture, is it brings a sense of, or it restores some confidence, some visibility in a very, very fragile environment where people are worrying on a day-to-day basis about how am I going to get to the end of this moment, forget about next month. And we've seen some of the data come out of Stats SA. I've shared in the vlogs we've been running anecdotal data coming from places like TransUnion and Yoko on the impacts of small business and on jobs. So I'm not really answering your question. Let me answer your question. 500 billion equals 10% of GDP. It's an extraordinary stimulus package, not only in its size, but also in its reach and in its potential impact.
Okay, so first question that every cynic amongst us asks is, well, two questions. Where does it come from? And once we've got it, how do we assure or ensure that it gets where it's supposed to go?
I think your first question is a really important one, is as much as the 500 billion is unprecedented, the responses to unprecedented economic and social impact. But one of the points of departure in the address was this stimulus is unprecedented. Indeed, it is unprecedented. And in its size and reach, arguably a very appropriate response. It puts it in, Trump territory, that 10% of GDP. What I think is misinterpreted in the 500 billion is that this is somehow 500 new billion. It's not. Some of it is new money. But if we disaggregate that 500, 130 of it is a reprioritization of existing spend. So for instance, some money will be taken from place A and given to place B, which might be in municipal spending, healthcare spending. So that's just reallocation of money, but it does make sure that it's going to places that are more vulnerable and that are most sensitive and are likely to have higher impact rather than lesser impact. So that goes under the label reprioritization. A second large raft of the 500 is 200 billion, and that comes in the form of the guarantee fund. The guarantee fund, what this does is it doesn't necessarily represent, and it doesn't represent at all government money being allocated to the economy. Instead, it is a guarantee that if the financial sector extends loans to business to the order of 200 billion, those loans will be guaranteed. Now, that establishes a level of confidence and will translate into a flow of 200 billion that will move with much greater confidence and certainty.
Now, where does that 200 billion guarantee come from?
Okay, so that comes from banks. That's not taxpayer money. It's not your and my money. It's not from the IMF. So the first one, 30 billion, is not new money, and the second 200 billion is not taxpayer money either. So there's 330 billion of 500 that is not government money. This is a policy brilliance, because he's able to take a stage and speak to us about this extraordinary stimulus. And it is a stimulus, and it gives us certainty and clarity and confidence in a very, very fragile environment. Not to be too curmudgeonly or grumpy in this environment, there are some helpful reliefs. So 70 billion in tax relief, and that will help companies. It's not that they've been forgiven 70 billion, but they can pay the 70 billion later. So that's also financial rearrangement, not necessarily new money. All of that said, there is this invaluable stimulus that you've already alluded to in the form of the 350 per month to unemployed people, and the lifting of the child welfare grant that will run on for 6 months. I would venture that that is probably the most effective way, the child welfare grant, of getting money into families, community, the desperately fragile part of South Africa's social fabric. That is new money. And if we add in all of the new money, we're short about 150 billion into the IMF.
Now, there are all sorts of conditions that go with borrowing money from the IMF. We all know about it, and everybody says, don't do it, don't do it. Well, we don't have an awful lot of options. So 2 questions for you. Yeah. What are the conditions that go with that? And secondly, I just had a chat with political analyst Max du Preez, and his big thing was, how are we going to make sure the money gets where it's going? So off you go.
Well, I mean, you've sort of stolen my second point, or your second point steals my first point, and that is allocating any amount of money is not a free lunch. So these funds will be borrowed. They're going to be borrowed at a 19 Rand dollar, which means even if interest rates are low, the currency cost is on the back of a very weak Rand. That money will have to be repaid. And so thinking about what happens to the economy from here after this relief moment, I think is a fundamental part of getting our heads around the rationale, the justification for borrowing this money. How do we make sure that it goes to the right place? Well, first, just before we go there, I sweepingly said enter the IMF. We don't yet know who the money is coming from, but it is likely to be an amalgam of World Bank, IMF, the New Development Bank, which is the BRICS Bank, the African Development Bank. So it'll be a consortium of multilateral lending agencies that give us this money at 19 to the dollar. So perhaps somewhere in the region of $7, $8, $9, $10 billion. And it will be at reasonable interest rates, not extortionate rates, but they can be made extortionate if we apply the loan poorly. This is the equivalent of going to a bank and borrowing money either to buy a new business or buy a new wardrobe. And that's where we have to think very carefully about the ways in which these funds are channeled into society. The other is about the importance of the structural reforms. And those were alluded to. No, they weren't alluded to. They were explicitly referenced. That Structural reform is part and parcel of this relief package, and that is stage 3. So Cyril Ramaphosa spoke about stage 1, which was the early relief announced as we went into lockdown. Stage 2 is this very big 500 billion package, and we shouldn't put it in the same package, but we could interpret with this the 2.25% interest rate cut. And then stage 3, phase 3, is the very necessary, long overdue, much spoken about, but not yet implemented structural reforms. Absent those, and when we have this conversation again, it will be about a country that has squandered the money, failed to achieve growth, spent the loans on current expenditure, and will have little to show for it. Someone has to pay back this money, and that someone is us, it's the taxpayer. There is no free lunch here. So this is why these structural reforms are absolutely critical.
So we have to introduce the reforms. We have to get the economy working. We have to then start making some money so that we can then pay back the loans, which would cripple us if we couldn't. And we're pretty close to crippled anyway. Who's going to manage the process? I think we've all seen Cyril at his best, but we've also seen weaknesses along the way. Will it be the Treasury? How do we know we're going to get people who can absolutely stop the squandering and the theft along the way?
This is the story of structural change and structural adjustment, which is unquestionably a bit of a swear word in development economics, because very often the legacy of structural adjustment is that it is imposed by multilateral agencies that don't have the necessary sensitivity to the domestic environment. And so it's a one-size-fits-all program that's imposed on countries that are coming with begging bowls. South Africa is in the reasonably strong position of not going in a state of absolute desperation. So, what we can insist on, what we can ensure is that the structural adjustments are fit for purpose. What we don't want to insist on is that we can borrow the money without any conditions. Otherwise, I think we run the very high risk, you're alluding to this, of more of the same. And more of the same takes our debt to GDP from 80% to 90% to 100%. It means that we feed current spending in the public sector rather than desperately needed investment in infrastructure spending. So those are some of the, I think, rules or requirements that we can anticipate from this lending. We can anticipate that the lending will come with those conditions. They're good conditions. They are not unpalatable conditions. At the same time, regardless of whether they come with or without conditions, I think we have to impose those conditions on ourselves with the simple recognition that we got ourselves here. We spent on the state-owned enterprises in unsustainable ways. We don't have much to show for that. We have grown a bloated and unsustainable public sector. We've made it more difficult to do business in the country. We've moved in terms of ease of doing business from 30th in the world to 80th in the world over the space of 10 years. Rwanda has sped past us. Those are all self-inflicted injuries. I think our job in the structural adjustment is the moment of reckoning or realization has to be, this wasn't done to us. We did this. 10 years ago, South Africa was 3% economic growth. We were in the process of hosting the World Cup. A sought-after tourist destination, 7 rand to the dollar. Can you believe that? 10 years ago. And here we are now with an unaffordable government balance sheet. The ratings agencies saying we are sub-investment grade. So all of this points to the critical requirement of these structural adjustments. And those are about fixing the SOEs, right-sizing the public service. There's some low-hanging fruit there, freeing up spectrum in the telecoms arena.
Well, Are you feeling better than you did 24 hours ago?
uh, I'm, I'm a reasonably cheerful economist today. You know, it's unusual. Our job as economists is to be depressing. You know, if we haven't depressed people, our work isn't done. You know, I don't want to be. I think it's very dangerous to either to be A, reactionary, and B, to be naive. So I am feeling better, not in sort of some wild response or reaction, but I'm feeling better because we've got some certainty. There's been a lot of swirling in conversations that I've been part of or that I've been aware of, talking about extensions of grants, relief funding, going and finding lending agencies, and so on. So a lot of that uncertainty is taken out of the system, and that's really valuable to this environment. That makes me feel better. We don't want to be naive. I think that's equally dangerous. And so whilst I'm feeling optimistic, I want to be informed and optimistic. And I take great courage from the explicit reference in Cyril Ramaphosa's address last night that these structural changes will now be implemented with a sense of purpose and speed and priority. I take great confidence and courage from that.
Adrian, thank you for that. Tomorrow we're going to know what the plans are with the lockdown. I think you and I have both seen some draft images of that, and they look reasonable. I'm surprised that they're talking about opening hairdressers. Let's find out. We'll both look a lot prettier.
Yes,
we'll both look a lot prettier when we see each other next time. Let's catch up soon.
And our go-to person in all of this is going to be Tito Mboweni. So watch Twitter for his pronouncements.
Yeah, I've also heard rumors that he's kind of heading for the top job. Interesting, huh?
Indeed. Interesting times. That's for another day. Huh?
See you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart.